All right, so what are we going to talk about? There's some great new features that we've released in version 6. Some of the main features that we're going to highlight in today's session is the whole concept about buffered data sources that we're introducing. Flow by nature connected to a whole bunch of historical-based data sources like historians and databases, but we are introducing this concept to buffer a little bit of real-time data from potential MQTT sources, OPCUA, and the likes like that. So we're going to show you how to set that up and how to configure that to buffer some data in real time. We've got a brand new kind of concept, if you can call it that, the concept of tags and having the capability to normalize data on a tag level and then really create some fancy and cool calculations on that. And Graham is going to take us through that whole concept, and I'll demo a few examples of that. And coupled with that, we also gave our manual entry forms a little bit of a rewrite, and Vaughan will cover that for us at the end of the presentation, just what changes you can expect from that perspective. So without further ado, I would like to just ask Graham if he can join us. And Graham, if you can maybe just quickly in a nutshell, just go over the Flow information platform and this whole new concept of tag normalization.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lenny. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I have a slight change to the way I want to do this, Lenny. So just for your info, I'm going to go through my 3 slides very quickly, and then I'm going to hand over to you to do the demo, if that's okay. All right. So the purpose of these webinars that we do is really educational. It's about talking about various concepts that we cover in our product, but also in the ecosystem of products that we work with and our partners. Now, some of you know Flow, and what we're going to be talking about today is mainly the new features that hopefully you will enjoy. But very quickly, for those of you that are new to Flow, I'm going to just take you through 3 slides very quickly, just to position Flow, give you a bit of an idea of what it is, what it does, and touch on some of the new features which Lenny is then going to demo. Okay, so the first thing we do is, well, first of all, let's start with what Flow is. Well, let's see how Flow can help you build an analytics foundation. The first thing that we do is we start with a model. Okay, Lenny, you're going to just have to progress as we go. Thank you. So really what we do is we provide this model essentially to structure your data, to pull your data in, to provide a hierarchy, to provide relationships between the data points, to add context. And that context can be asset-based, it can be KPI-based. There are various ways that you can model your Flow system, and we provide that flexibility for you. But now we need to actually connect to various data sources in order to populate that model. So the types of data sources that we have, then you can progress there. First of all, we have a class of data sources which falls under real time. And for those that are not new to Flow, you'll know that this is something new to Flow. The next class of data sources is your time series databases, your purpose-built historians. So examples would include Canary, Ignition, OSIPy, InfluxDB, et cetera, et cetera. You would probably know many of these types of historians. The third class of data sources is your relational and transactional data sources. Typically your SQL-based data sources, so Microsoft SQL, MySQL, Oracle, PostgreSQL, and the types of applications you would typically connect to in an industrial sense would be your ERP system. So maybe you've got an SAP, data marts, your manufacturing execution systems, your LIMS, laboratory information management systems for quality, your weighbridge systems for your trucks coming in and out of your facility, and potentially your alarm databases that you may have. So these are all external data sources that we consume into Flow. We have a final class, which is the Flow forms. Lenny, if you can just advance there. Now, Flow forms allows us to create or configure forms for manual data capture, for correction of data retrospectively, for categorization of data. So, for example, categorizing a downtime event, or providing additional context around a batch, for example. So that's what we use these Flow forms for. Okay, then we move on to the third step, and that is transform. So we're getting all this data in. Now we need to start doing something with this data to make it useful. Great. So let's take an example of a canary historian. For example, one of our favorite historians. We have a historian tag that we're connecting into, and we bring that data in. Now it comes in as a series, a time series of points. And inside Flow, before we go there, let's connect another data source. So a Microsoft SQL database. So we can write a SQL query that will transform, as we are consuming that data, it'll transform it into a series of timestamps and values. And inside Flow, we call these things tags. And I'm sure you are all familiar with the concept of tags. But what if we want to create a calculation between these two tags? And bear in mind that they're coming from two different data sources. So the first thing we do is what we call point normalization. And that allows us to achieve zero data loss. Coming from these two data sources, performing the point normalization, we can then create a row-based calculation. And we call this a calculated tag. So let's look at a few examples, and Lenny's actually going to demonstrate some of these examples. So filtering out bad quality. So in industrial systems, we're going to get bad quality sometimes coming from our underlying data source. So maybe we want to filter that out completely from any downstream calculations or aggregations that we're going to do. That's example one. Example two, maybe we want to filter any data outside of a band and eliminate that data. Maybe there's outliers that we want to get rid of. So we want to perform a kind of a data cleansing process by means of a calculated tag. And the third example is actually potentially combining multiple data sources together. And the example that Lenny's going to show you is we connect into an MES database. We get an active flag from the database as to when something is running, and we get the actual totalizer from a canary tag, and we want to filter out the data so that we're only using the data when the machine is active. So Lenny's going to take you through that detail. A concept that many of you will know about, we call them measures, but you can think of it as a KPI tag or an aggregated tag. So let's look at the mechanism here. So what this thing does is it takes all of that series of points, whether they're coming from a tag or a calculated tag, it actually splits out the timeline and it performs aggregations on each of those periods. And we call this period normalization. So we do aggregations on the data points which fall within the periods, which allow us to then further downstream do calculated KPI tags, which are period-based calculations. And in effect, what this is doing, it's translating the time series data back
as Graham was explaining, we do this period normalization, and effectively we are able to then have this single data point per period. And as you know, if you're familiar with Flow, that period is determined by your calendar requirements. And then, Lenny, if you can progress one more, we then have another layer that we can apply to these points, and that is the context overlay. So you may be familiar with the concept of an event in Flow, and that is effectively us overlaying context over these measure values that you've normalized in terms of the period. So we can then have this data with respect to a different time period from your standard calendar with respect to event time periods. And along with that, we can add attributes to give us that context that we need to associate with the information. Then?
All right, perfect. Thanks, Vaughan. So obviously, if we complete the picture here, after we've transformed the data now and performed our KPI calculations, then the next step is to visualize it. Now, we do have our own internal visualization where you can configure your own dashboarding and reporting. We do have the capability to bridge that out as well. So if you want to, we're not a closed-off system, so we work very hard in keeping the Flow system open by means of open technologies. And one of those open technologies that we have is the capability to also write back to our data sources, so we can push data back to a data mart as an example. Based on the KPIs that we've collected, we can potentially push it back to the historian if that KPI calculation might be useful in the historian as a point, and we can push it back to the real-time system as well. Now, we also integrate this into communication methods. So if I want to send a message or a notification to my Teams channel or to Slack or to email, we can use those mechanisms as well to now alert people and have people have that little bit of integration and add context to the data and their KPIs if there was an exception exceeded as an example. The other one that we have is a REST API. Now, this REST API is great if I potentially don't want to utilize the built-in visualization from Flow. It discovers not only the data that sits in Flow, it does provide you the context of the model, which is very important. So I can go and create a connection to a Power BI as an example, or a BI tool, and I have this already structured model in place. So I can now really use that to slice and dice and do my descriptive analytics in those types of tools. So it's open, and again, you can get the data that's now already cleansed as well into your machine learning platforms, and potentially want to build a nice SCADA or visualization component for that KPI that you've created right back to your operator on the SCADA level. So we do have that integration to utilize our REST API for that as well. And then obviously, when we start looking at enterprise solutions where we need to get data consolidated at one level, if we want to start doing benchmark comparisons between sites, then obviously we do have the capability to do roll-ups to an enterprise instance of Flow, and we use our tiering mechanism to do that. And this is why we say it's an all-encompass analytics hub, or the foundation for proper analytics. It is one place where we have a normalized model that's abstracted from your data sources, that cleans and transforms the data and makes that data available for pretty much any forms or mean necessary for other applications and systems as well. All right, I'm going to quickly jump now into demo mode. So one thing that I'm going to do very quickly is I'm going to talk about these real-time data sources that we have. So they are brand new in Flow. So I'm going to go here to my demo system, and you'll notice on the data source level, this is where we configure what data sources of information is available into Flow, that we've extended this list a little bit. So you will be familiar with all as Graham said, all those different classes of data sources, like historical data sources or a little bit more database related ones. But you notice there's a few new ones. So the first one that we've got is MQTT. Obviously, that's a very popular protocol now with IoT. So we now have the capability to connect to an MQTT broker and either consume a custom payload on that broker or to consume a Spark-Plug-B protocol of that payload. We also have the capability to connect to Telegraf. Telegraf is a little utility that connects to a whole bunch of performance counters of your servers potentially. So CPU usage, memory usage. It's got tons of inputs. You can even hook it up to Modbus device if you really wanted to. So we're leveraging that technology to potentially get data from a Modbus sensor or to build IT-related dashboards concerning your hardware infrastructure. And then the last one that we've included is from OPC. We always had the capability to consume historical data from OPC, but now we have the capability to consume OPC UA data and buffer this. We only buffer this data for 7 days. The reason being that you would use the point normalization and the period normalization to store this resultant aggregate or KPI in your database. And after that, we will then just clear out this real-time buffer. All right, so I've configured a few here. I've got one that's configured to look at a public broker. This is HiveMQ. This is a public broker that the guys from HiveMQ have. It is looking at a custom payload at this point in time. I'm looking at a topic called Flow v6. And if I go and expand my topic here, I can see there's a whole bunch of tags getting pushed in here. I've asked some of my colleagues to push data onto the system. So let's have a look here. Leon, he sits in the UK. So let's see if he's got some data for us. Nothing yet. There's some data from Rikus. There's data coming from Rikus. And we've got data coming in from Vaughan as well. So as they're starting pushing that data, we're starting to connect and buffer that data. I can also potentially do it. So I've got a little MQTT client that I can push some data in as well. But we will build this namespace, and as new data come in from that client, there we go. Thanks, everybody. There's a few new tags that came in, and there's the value. So getting data from a custom payload as well. I've also connected one with the Spark-Plug-B protocol, and that will then obviously consume the data from the Spark-Plug-B solution. And this is a little bit more related data. So these are a whole bunch of analyzers. I think this is a pH sensor, and this is the data that's getting pushed from that pH sensor into my MQTT buffer. And again, I can now utilize this as I would have in Flow normally as a historical data source to do my aggregate KPIs and calculations. I've also included a Telegraf one. So the Telegraf one, connected it to my actual server here. So it will go and look at the CPU, the disk, and the memory usage of my server. So if I look at the memory here on this device, on this server, it's got about 20 gigs of memory available. If I look at this graph, if I look at my task manager here and look at the performance, correct, I've got about 20 gigs of memory free on this. So I can get the memory usage based on that. The cool thing is, though, as you can see, is I also have Modbus data coming in here. So that is the beauty of that Telegraf little consumer or data collector, because now I can potentially look at a whole bunch of power meter usage, power meters that comes in from Modbus, and I can start getting Modbus data into my solution as well. Again, it's a buffer, 7 days. We will always look at recommending a full-blown industrial plant-based historian like the Canary historian, but for small applications where the infrastructure is maybe not at that level or the journey to information is not at that level, we do have this capability to get them started very quickly. All right, so we've got those 3 new real-time data sources to get data in from there. Now, this whole new tag concept is something new that's new in Flow. So what we've done to help with that is, if I go to our website, the guys that joined our last webinar, you would remember that underneath the Try Flow option on our webinar, we're starting to include models. And these models is there to help you to set up a system very quickly and to look at some of these concepts that we are discussing in these webinars. So one that we've added is how would I use these new tag calculations to normalize my tag in solutions. And I can simply download it from here, and it will now download it, and I can just import it into my flow system. All right, so it's downloaded there. I've got a blank new system here that's configured. So I'm just going to quickly go and import that download, go to my downloads, and there we go. It will create all the data sources and everything that's required. Hit on the import button. It's just going to warn you that it's going to create a whole bunch of measures and components. And you can utilize this demo that I'm playing with right here, right now, in your own time as well. So there's the whole bunch of templates that I've created with those 3 scenarios that Gray mentioned, based on filtering out quality, data, or multiple data sources. All right, so that's available. I would encourage you guys to go and download it and play along with this new tag concept. All right, so I've done that already. I've created these 3 components here, and let's quickly have a look at them. All right, so the first one that we're going to look at is filtering out quality. Okay, now if I expand this, I'm going to look at a counter, a normal totalizer value, but I don't want to include bad quality in that aggregation to say what is the total for potentially the hour or the day. So I'm going to filter out any bad OPC quality from this. Now you'll notice there's a new icon in Flow. All right. For the guys that's familiar, we always have the capability to create minutely data, hourly data, and to do our aggregations rollups. We now included the tag concept. All right. So this now represents a tag where I can now look at the raw data coming from that tag. So if I open this up, there we go. It now queries the data source. Again, we do not replicate this, guys. It's a pass through to that raw data in the historian. And here I've got a very simple totalizer value that I've got. What I'm going to do with this is I'm actually going to filter it out. And what I'm going to filter out is just anywhere where there's bad OPC quality. So if I open up this guy here, I can now create a calculated tag based on my source data. Click on the calculator here, click on the retrieval section here, and now it becomes a very simple equation. I can say, all right, if I look at my source data, if any of that quality is not equal to 192, which is the good component of OPC, then return null, else return the actual value itself. So if I'm going to look a little bit back at some historical data here, I can see there all of these blanks is where the data was bad. All right, so I'm not going to use that in my calculations. I've created a little bit of visualization for this as well, part of that demo or that examples. So if I look at my quality dashboard here, I can see what's happening. I can see what the current quality is. Currently, the quality is all good, so everything will be used in the calculation. If I look at last night, there were some issues with my control system. So here I can see that there was a dip in the quality. I'm excluding that from the calculation, and you'll notice that it is a straight line. So I'm not going to use that in the aggregate going forward. So that's the first one that I can go and exclude quality from a calculation perspective. Second example that we have is to filter data. Now you might say, Lenny, we always had the capability to filter data. On a measure, you had the concept of a filter tag. That is correct. But what if you wanted to filter on more, or 2 or 3 or 4, or even data from another data source? We didn't have that capability. So in this scenario that I've got here is I've got a sensor, which is an analyzer, a pH sensor, but I've got a higher upper and a lower limit band that I want to go and exclude from my calculations. So in the calculation that I've performed here is I'm actually looking at a little bit of a user-defined function that I've created. And you'll notice that I can now use my model attributes. So in my model attributes, I say, okay, I've got an upper and lower limit for this instrument. Anything above that, I want to discard. Anything below that, I want to discard. And I don't want to use that in my aggregation going up when I create my KPI. So I can pass that information into my user-defined function. And the function is very simple. I've created a little user-defined function here that filter out bands, and literally all that it says is, you know what, if that value is above and below the upper and the lower, then return it, else return a null. And remember, nulls flow handles by default. We do not include null value points in our aggregations. So when I go and look at potentially the min and the max KPIs for my pH, it will never be above the upper limit and it will never be below the lower limit. So again, create a little dashboard for that. So let's look at the filter bands dashboard here. This is the raw signal, the green. This is the raw analyzer. The one at the bottom is the filter one. We can clearly see the gaps of where the nulls are. So anything in this time period was below or potentially above my limit. And we can notice here, if I look at my min and my max KPIs, they're never above the 6.6 or never lower than the 5.8 because I'm completely removing that from my controls, from my calculations and my aggregate to the next level. Right, and then the last one, and I think this is probably my favorite, and it's the most powerful one, is the fact that we can include multiple data sources in this. Now, you'll notice in my data source list, I do have an historian, but I also have this schedule database. So this is the MES database that we've got. It tells me when I'm scheduled to run or not run production, and I only want to look at production counters when I'm physically active or scheduled to run. So I've got, again, a tag that pulls the schedule from the SQL database. So there's my schedule. It's a very simple SQL query where I look at if I'm active or not. I then have the source, which is the totalizer in the PLC. Again, totalizer going up. And now I'm going to marry the two. I'm going to say, I only want to see this value when I'm active to produce data. All right, give it a little bit more time frame here, and here you can see all of these gaps is gaps where I was not scheduled for production. So I'm not going to include those when I actually aggregate this up higher into my higher levels. Again, I create a little dashboard for this. So under multiple data sources, I've got the schedule. So this is the raw schedule coming through from the SQL database. This is the totalizer coming through from our historian. And you'll notice that every time it is down, not active, it's a straight line. So we don't include that increased in production. And we can clearly see it here. We can see that the one that I filtered, only when it's active, its production count is always less. It will never be high. It's always less than the one that's not filtered. So in this case, I was not actually scheduled to run, but I still pumped out a whole bunch of bottles from that production line. So that's how we can marry two different data sources to actually create this and create these point normalization points from that perspective. And again, it's available for you guys to download, and you can see how I created these calculations. From the guys that know Flow a little bit in the past, this was only really possible. Well, multiple data sources was never possible. Some of the band filtering and the quality filtering, you had to go and do custom expressions, and that was a bit hairy. So we really tried to make this as simple as easy to transform and to clean your data to make it available for different systems. All right, so that's very quickly some of the new features in the solution. We're almost running out of time here. One last thing that I'm going to ask Vaughan just to quickly go through with us is forms. So on this whole architecture of Flow, a very important component for us is manual entry. All right, so manual entry for us is a little bit of a differentiator that we can go and audit and rectify and add context to data. And we've done quite a lot of work with forms in this release. Vaughan, if you can maybe just touch on some of those points.
Yeah, thanks, Lenny. As Lenny mentioned, we did quite a bit of work in version 6 with forms. Effectively, we've revamped or rewritten forms. So one of the things you'll notice is that there is no forms tab anymore. We merge everything into an information tab. What we can do in this information tab is combine your charts and your forms, and it allows you to minimize the amount of security config and so forth that you need to do. But what you're seeing on the screen here is the ability to create a template form. So now if you have, for example, a form that has an event, that's a template event, and in your Flow system, you've used this event a few times, you've instantiated this template event, for example, here, It's instantiated into three times for 3 different lines. The flow server will go and look up what instances you have of this event, and it will dynamically build out the form for you. In this case, you can see there's 3 tabs for your 3 lines, even though we've only configured that event in one place. We can use model attributes as well in order to name these things appropriately. And depending on the type of form, you can create different tabs or different columns or different rows in your form based on the number of instances that you have. One more thing that we'd like to call out is the fact that the forms now use what we call the chart framework. So if you're familiar with how we configure charts, well, certainly since version 5 of Flow, it's a similar mechanism to configure your forms. If we have a look at the next slide, you will see that the configurator looks very much like how it looks for charts. So what that does, though, is it gives us all the formatting opportunities that we had in charts. You can now add partition headers, you can add a unit of measure, you can add your limits to your forms, you can even format individual things such as, in this case, your time format on your base header. Those are just a few of the things that you can do with the new forms. As we said, you could do everything you could do with charts with forms as well, and everything that you could do with forms, you can still do with forms. Thanks, Lenny.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. All right. That is it for the time that we've got. I know we ran a little bit over. I'm appreciative of everybody staying on while we finalize here. Thank you very much. I would encourage you guys. Yes, Graham.
Sorry, I know we're out of time, but for anybody that is able to spend an extra 2 minutes, we've had 2 interesting questions, and I think it's worth just quickly talking through these. The first one is, and sorry, I dropped off there. I had load shedding, which some of us will understand what that means. The first question, with these new tags that we've introduced, the question is, how does that affect our licensing model? Well, thank goodness we've decided not to change the licensing model at all. So effectively, because you are already paying for your tags in your historian, or you're paying for your license for your SQL Server, or whatever the case may be, we don't feel it's necessary to charge you again just to pull that into Flow. So the tag concept within Flow, including calculated tags, there is no additional charge to our license model. So go wild, enjoy it. We certainly are loving the new feature. The second question is around the buffering of real-time data. The question is, I heard that it keeps 7 days. Yes, that's correct. It keeps it for 7 days. Yes, so the intention of this real-time buffer is not to replace the functionality of a purpose-built historian. And it will always be our recommendation to our customers to build their architecture on top of a proper purpose-built historian that stores data forever, high resolution time series data. That is the buffering that Flow is built in now is not to replace that functionality. So I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Lenny.
Thanks, Graham. All right, that is what we've got for today's half an hour. I hope you guys found that valuable. If you've got any questions, if you want to see any of these features in live action or a little bit more information around it, please get in contact with us. I think we'll jump back on the educational bandwagon on the next session. Talk a little bit about some of the other buzzwords. So just leveraging off of that series that we've got around the buzzwords in the industry. Until then, I say thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.